You're listening to Midwest Coven Cast Presents Weekend Reads. I'm Marilyn of Midwest Coven Cast. Here in Season 3 of Weekend Reads, we will be making our way through the 1922 abridgment of Sir James Frazer's The Golden Bough. You can visit MidwestCovenCast.com to find podcast extras, including a free online copy of the text. Consider supporting Midwest Coven Cast and Weekend Reads on Patreon for access to additional materials, like a serialized official Midwest Coven Cast Presents Weekend Reads ebook with additional notes about the text and some editorial modernizations straight from, well, me. Now, Coven, it is time to cozy up with your coffee or tea and enjoy this episode of Weekend Reads. Chapter 58, Human Scapegoats in Classical Antiquity. Subsection 1. The human scapegoat in ancient Rome. We are now prepared to notice the use of the human scapegoat in classical antiquity. Every year on the 14th of March, a man clad in skins was led in procession through the streets of Rome, beaten with long white rods, and driven out of the city. He was called Marilyn, that is, the Old Mars, and as the ceremony took place on the day preceding the first full moon of the Roman year, which began on the 1st of March, the skin-clad man must have represented the Mars of the past year, who was driven out at the beginning of a new one. Now Mars was originally not a god of war, but of vegetation. For it was to Mars that the Roman husbandman prayed for the prosperity of his corn and his vines, his fruit trees, and his copses. It was to Mars that the priestly college of the Arval brothers, whose business it was to sacrifice for the growth of the crops, addressed their petitions almost exclusively. And it was to Mars, as we saw, that a horse was sacrificed in October to secure an abundant harvest. Moreover, it was to Mars, under his title of Mars of their Woods, Mars Sylvanus, that farmers offered sacrifice for the welfare of their cattle. We have already seen that the cattle are commonly supposed to be under the special patronage of tree gods. Once more, the consecration of the vernal month of March to Mars seems to point him out as the deity of the sprouting vegetation. Thus, the Roman custom of expelling the old Mars at the beginning of the new year in spring is identical with the Slavonic custom of carrying out death, if the view were taken of the latter custom is correct. The similarity of the Roman and Slavonic customs has been already remarked by scholars who appear, however, to have taken Mammarius Veturius and the corresponding figures in the Slavonic ceremonies to be representatives of the old year rather than the old god of vegetation. It is possible that ceremonies of this kind may have come to be thus interpreted in later times, even by the people who practiced them. But the personification of a period of time is too abstract an idea to be primitive. However, in the Roman, as in the Slavonic ceremony, the representative of the god appears to have been treated not only as a deity of vegetation, but also as a scapegoat. His expulsion implies this, for there is no reason why the god of vegetation, as such, should be expelled the city, but it is otherwise if he is also a scapegoat. It then becomes necessary to drive him beyond the boundaries, that he may carry his sorrowful burden away to other lands, and, in fact, Mammarius Veturius appears to have been driven away to the land of the Oscans, the enemies of Rome. Subsection 2. The human scapegoat in ancient Greece. The ancient Greeks were also familiar with the use of a human scapegoat. In Plutarch's native town of Chaeronea, a ceremony of this kind was performed by the chief magistrate at the town hall, and by each householder at his own home. It was called the expulsion of hunger. A slave was beaten with rods of the Agnus Castus, and turned out of doors with the words, "Out with hunger, and in with wealth and health." When Plutarch held the office of chief magistrate of his native town, he performed this ceremony at the town hall, and he has recorded the discussion to which the custom afterwards gave rise. But in civilized Greece, the custom of the scapegoat took darker forms than the innocent rite over which the amiable and pious Plutarch presided. Whenever Marseilles, one of the busiest and most brilliant of Greek colonies, was ravaged by a plague, a man of the poorer classes used to offer himself as a scapegoat. For a whole year he was maintained at the public expense, being fed on choice and pure food. At the expiry of the year, he was dressed in sacred garments, decked with holy branches, and led through the whole city, while prayers were uttered that all the evils of the people might fall on his head. He was then cast out of the city or stoned to death by the people outside of the walls. The Athenians regularly maintained a number of degraded and useless beings at the public expense, and when any calamity such as plague, drought, or famine befell the city, they sacrificed 2 of these outcast scapegoats. One of the victims was sacrificed for the men, and the other for the women. The former wore around his neck a string of black, the latter a string of white figs. Sometimes, it seems, the victim slain on behalf of the women was a woman. They were led about the city and then sacrificed, apparently by being stoned to death outside the city. But such sacrifices were not confined to extraordinary occasions of public calamity. It appears that every year at the festival of the Thargelia in May, 2 victims, one for the men and one for the women, were led out of Athens and stoned to death. The city of Abdera in Thrace was publicly purified once a year, and one of the burghers, set apart for the purpose, was stoned to death as a scapegoat or vicarious sacrifice for the life of all the others. 6 days before his execution, he was excommunicated in order that he alone might bear the sins of all the people. From the Lover's Leap, a white bluff at the southern end of their island, the Leucadians used annually to hurl a criminal into the sea as a scapegoat. But to lighten his fall, they fastened live birds and feathers to him, and a flotilla of small boats waited below to catch him and convey him beyond the boundary. Probably these humane precautions were a mitigation of an earlier custom of flinging the scapegoat into the sea to drown. The Leucadian ceremony took place at the time of a sacrifice to Apollo, who had a temple or sanctuary on the spot. Elsewhere, it was customary to cast a young man every year into the sea with the prayer, "Be thou our offscouring." This ceremony was supposed to rid the people of the evils by which they were beset, or, according to a somewhat different interpretation, it redeemed them by paying the debt they owed to the sea god. As practiced by the Greeks of Asia Minor in the 6th century before our era, the custom of the scapegoat was as follows. When a city suffered from plague, famine, or other public calamity, an ugly or deformed person was chosen to take upon himself all the evils which afflicted the community. He was brought to a suitable place, where dried figs, a barley loaf, and cheese were put into his hand. These he ate. Then he was beaten 7 times upon his genital organs with squills and branches of the wild fig and other wild trees, while the flutes played a particular tune. Afterwards he was burned on a pyre built of the wood of forest trees, and his ashes were cast into the sea. A similar custom appears to have been annually celebrated by the Asiatic Greeks at the harvest festival of the Thargelia. In the ritual just described, the scourging of the victim with squills, branches of the wild fig, and so forth, cannot have been intended to aggravate his sufferings. Otherwise, any stick would have been good enough to beat him with. The true meaning of this part of the ceremony has been explained by W. Manhart. He points out that the ancients attributed to squills a magical power of averting evil influences, and that accordingly they hung them up at the doors of their houses and made use of them in purificatory rites. Hence the Arcadian custom of whipping the image of Pan with squills at a festival, or whenever the hunters returned empty-handed, must have been meant not to punish the god, but to purify him from the harmful influences which were impeding him in the exercise of his divine functions as a god, and who should supply the hunter with game. Similarly, the object of beating the human scapegoat on the genital organs with squills and so on must have been to release his reproductive energies from any restraint or spell under which they might be laid by demoniacal or other malignant agency. And as the Thargelia, at which he was annually sacrificed, was an early harvest festival celebrated in May, we must recognize in him a representative of the creative and fertilizing god of vegetation. The representative of the god was annually slain for the purpose I have indicated, that of maintaining the divine life in perpetual vigor, untainted by the weakness of age, and before he was put to death it was not unnatural to stimulate his reproductive powers in order that these might be transmitted in full activity to his successor, the new god or new embodiment of the old god, who was doubtless supposed immediately to take the place of the one slain. Similar reasoning would lead to a similar treatment of the scapegoat on special occasions, such as drought or famine. If the crops did not answer to the expectation of the husbandman, this would be attributed to some failure in the generative powers of the god whose function it was to produce the fruits of the earth. It might be thought that he was under a spell, or was growing old and feeble. Accordingly, he was slain in the person of his representative, with all the ceremonies already described, in order that, born young again, he might infuse his own youthful vigor into the stagnant energies of nature. On the same principle, we can understand why Mammarius Veturius was beaten with rods, why the slave at the Cheronian ceremony was beaten with the Agnus Castus, a tree to which magical properties were ascribed, why the effigy of death in some parts of Europe is assailed with sticks and stones, and why at Babylon the criminal who played the god scourged before he was crucified. The purpose of the scourging was not to intensify the agony of the divine sufferer, but on the contrary to dispel any malignant influences by which, at the supreme moment, he might conceivably be beset. Thus far I have assumed that the human victims at the Thargelia represented the spirits of vegetation in general, but it has been well remarked by Mr. W.R. Peyton that these poor wretches seem to have masqueraded as the spirits of fig trees in particular. He points out that the process of caprification, as it is called, that is, the artificial fertilization of the cultivated fig trees by hanging strings of wild figs among the boughs, takes place in Greece and Asia Minor in June, about a month after the date of the Thargelia, and he suggests that the hanging of the black and white figs round the necks of the two human victims, one of whom represented the men and the other the women, may have been a direct imitation of the process of caprification designed, on the principle of imitative magic, to assist the fertilization of the fig trees. And since caprification is in fact a marriage of the male fig tree and the female fig tree, Mr. Peyton further supposes that the loves of the trees may, on the same principle of imitative magic, have been simulated by a mock or even a real marriage between the two human victims, one of whom appears sometimes to have been a woman. On this view, the practice of beating the human victims on their genitals with branches of wild fig trees and with squills was a charm intended to stimulate the generative powers of the man and woman, who, for the time being, personated the male and the female fig trees respectively, and who, by their union in marriage, whether real or pretended, were believed to help the trees to bear fruit. The interpretation which I have adopted of the custom of beating the human scapegoat with certain plants is supported by many analogies. Thus, among the Kai of German New Guinea, when a man wishes to make his banana shoots bear fruit quickly, he beats them with a stick cut from a banana tree which has already borne fruit. Here it is obvious the fruitfulness is believed to inhere in a stick cut from a fruitful tree, and to be imparted by contact to the young banana plants. Similarly, in New Caledonia, a man will beat his taro plants lightly with a branch, saying as he does so, "I beat this taro that it may grow," after which he plants the branch in the ground at the end of the field. Among the Indians of Brazil, at the mouth of the Amazon, when a man wishes to increase the size of his generative organ, he strikes it with the fruit of a white aquatic plant called aninga, which grows luxuriantly on the banks of the river. The fruit, which is inedible, resembles a banana, and is clearly chosen for the purpose on account of its shape. The ceremony should be performed 3 days before or after the new moon. In the county of Bekis, in Hungary, barren women are fertilized by being struck with a stick which has first been used to separate pairing dogs. Here a fertilizing virtue is clearly supposed to be inherent in the stick and to be conveyed by contact to the women. The Tarajas of Central Celebes think that the plant Dracæna terminalis has a strong soul, because when it is lopped, it soon grows up again. Hence, when a man is ill, his friends will sometimes beat him in the crown of the head with Dracæna leaves, in order to strengthen his weak soul with the strong soul of the plant. These analogies accordingly support the interpretation which, following my predecessors, W. Manhart and Mr. W.R. Peyton, I have given of the beating inflicted on the human victims at the Greek harvest festival of the Thargelia. This beating being administered to the generative organs of the victims by fresh green plants and branches is most naturally explained as a charm to increase the reproductive energies of the men or women, either by communicating to them the fruitfulness of the plants and branches, or by ridding them of the maleficent influences. And this interpretation is confirmed by the observation that the two victims represented the two sexes, one of them standing for the men in general, and the other for the women. The season of the year when the ceremony was performed, namely the time of the corn harvest, tallies well with the theory that the rite had an agricultural significance. Further, that it was above all intended to fertilize the fig trees is strongly suggested by the strings of black and white figs which were hung round the necks of the victims, as well as by the blows which were given their genital organs with the branches of a wild fig tree. Since this procedure closely resembles the procedure which ancient and modern husbandmen in Greek lands have regularly resorted to for the purpose of actually fertilizing their fig trees, When we remember that an important part of the artificial fertilization of the date palm tree appears to have played of old not only in the husbandry, but in the religion of Mesopotamia, there seems no reason to doubt that the artificial fertilization of the fig tree may in like manner have vindicated for itself a place in the solemn ritual of Greek religion. If these considerations are just, we must apparently conclude that while the human victims at the Thargelia certainly appear in later classical times to have figured chiefly as public scapegoats, who carried away with them the sins, misfortunes, and sorrows of the whole people, at an earlier time they may have been looked on as embodiments of vegetation, perhaps of the corn, but particularly of the fig trees, and that the beating which they received and the death which they died were intended primarily to brace and refresh the powers of vegetation when beginning to droop and languish under the torrid heat of the Greek summer. The view here taken of the Greek scapegoat, if it is correct, obviates an objection which might otherwise be brought against the main argument of this book, to the theory that the priest of Orisha was slain as a representative of the spirit of the grove. It might have been objected that such a custom has no analogy in classical antiquity, but reasons have now been given for believing that the human being periodically and occasionally slain by the Asiatic Greeks was regularly treated as an embodiment of a divinity of vegetation. Probably the persons whom the Athenians kept to be sacrificed were similarly treated as divine. That they were social outcasts did not matter. On the primitive view, a man is not chosen to be the mouthpiece or embodiment of a god on account of his high moral qualities or social rank. The divine Aphodus descends equally on the good and the bad, the lofty and the lowly. If then the civilized Greeks of Asia and Athens habitually sacrificed men whom they regarded as incarnate gods, there can be no inherent improbability in the supposition that at the dawn of history a similar custom was observed by the semi-barbarous Latins in their Rhaetian grove. But to clinch the argument, it is clearly desirable to prove that the custom of putting to death a human representative of a god was known and practiced in ancient Italy, elsewhere than in the Rhaetian grove. This proof I now propose to adduce. Subsection 3. The Roman Saturnalia. We have seen that many peoples have been used to observe an annual period of license, when the customary restraints of law and morality are thrown aside, when the whole population give themselves up to extravagant mirth and jollity, and when the darker passions find vent which would never be allowed them in the more staid and sober course of ordinary life. Such outbursts of the pent-up forces of human nature, too often degenerating into wild orgies of lust and crime, occur most commonly at the end of the year, and are frequently associated, as I have had occasion to point out, with one or other of the agricultural seasons, especially with the time of sowing or of harvest. Now, of all these periods of license, the one which is best known, and which in modern language has given its name to the rest, is the Saturnalia. This famous festival in December, the last month of the Roman year, and was popularly supposed to commemorate the merry reign of Saturn, the god of sowing and husbandry, who lived on earth long ago as a righteous and beneficent king of Italy, drew the rude and scattered dwellers on the mountains together, taught them to till the ground, gave them laws, and ruled in peace. His reign was the fabled Golden Age. The earth brought forth abundantly. No sound of war or discord troubled the happy world. No baleful love of lucre worked like poison in the blood of the industrious and contented peasantry. Slavery and private property were alike unknown. All men had all things in common. At last the good God, the kindly king, vanished suddenly. But his memory was cherished to distant ages. Shrines were reared in his honor, and many hills and high places in Italy bore his name. Yet the bright tradition of his reign was crossed by a dark shadow. His altars are said to have been stained with the blood of human victims, for whom a more merciful age afterwards substituted effigies. Of this gloomy side of the god's religion, there is little or no trace in the descriptions which ancient writers have left us of the Saturnalia. Feasting and revelry, and all the mad pursuit of pleasure are the features that seem to have especially marked this carnival of antiquity, as it went on for 7 days in the streets and public squares and houses of ancient Rome, from the 17th to the 23rd of December. But no feature of the festival is more remarkable. Nothing in it seems to have struck the ancients themselves more than the license granted to slaves at this time. The distinction between the free and the servile classes was temporarily abolished. The slave might rail at his master, intoxicate himself like his betters, sit down at a table with them, and not even a word of reproof would be administered to him for conduct which at any other season might have been punished with stripes, imprisonment, or death. Nay, more masters actually changed places with their slaves, and waited on them at table, and not till the serf had done eating and drinking was the board cleared and dinner set for his master. So far was this inversion of ranks carried, that each household became for a time a mimic republic, in which the high offices of state were discharged by the slaves, who gave their orders, and laid down the law, as if they were indeed invested with all the dignity of the consulship, the praetorship, and the bench. Like the pale reflection of power thus accorded to bondsmen at the Saturnalia, was the mock kingship for which freemen cast lots at the same season. The person on whom the lot fell enjoyed the title of king, and issued commands of a playful and ludicrous nature to his temporary subjects. One of them he might order to mix the wine, another to drink, another to sing, another to dance, another to speak in his own dispraise, another to carry a flute girl on his back around the house. Now, when we remember that the liberty allowed to slaves at this festive season was supposed to be an imitation of the state of society in Saturn's time, and that in general the Saturnalia passed for nothing more or less than a temporary revival or restoration of the reign of that merry monarch, we are tempted to surmise that the mock king who presided over the revels may have originally represented Saturn himself. The conjecture is strongly confirmed, if not established, by a very curious and interesting account of the way in which the Saturnalia was celebrated by the Roman soldiers stationed on the Danube in the reign of Maximian and Diocletian. The account is preserved in a narrative of the martyrdom of St. Decius, which was unearthed from a Greek manuscript in the Paris Library, and published by Professor Franz Cumont of Ghent. Two briefer descriptions of the event and of the custom are contained in manuscripts at Milan and Berlin. One of them had already seen the light in an obscure volume printed at Urbino in 1727, but its importance for the history of the Roman religion, both ancient and modern, appears to have been overlooked until Professor Cumont drew the attention of scholars to all three narratives by publishing them together some years ago. According to these narratives, which have all the appearance of being authentic, and of which the lowest is probably based on official documents, the Roman soldiers at Durostorum in Lower Moesia celebrated the Saturnalia year by year in the following manner. 30 days before the festival, they chose by lot from amongst themselves a young and handsome man, who was then clothed in royal attire to resemble Saturn. Thus arrayed and attended by a multitude of soldiers, he went about in public with full license to indulge his passions and to taste of every pleasure, however base and shameful. But if his reign was merry, it was short and ended tragically, for when the 30 days were up and the festival of Saturn had come, he cut his own throat on the altar of the god whom he personated. In the year A.D. 303, the lot fell upon the Christian soldier Decius, but he refused to play the part of the heathen god and soil his last days by debauchery. The threats and arguments of his commanding officer Basis failed to shake his constancy, and accordingly he was beheaded, as the Christian martyrologist records with minute accuracy at Durostorum, by the soldier John on Friday, the 20th day of November, being the 24th day of the moon, at the 4th hour. Since this narrative was published by Professor Cumont, its historical character, which had been doubted or denied, has received strong confirmation from an interesting discovery. In the crypt of the cathedral which crowns the promontory of Ancona, there is preserved, among other remarkable antiquities, a white marble sarcophagus bearing a Greek inscription, in characters of the age of Justinian, to the following effect: "Here lies the holy martyr Decius, brought from Durostorum." The sarcophagus was transferred to the crypt of the cathedral in 1848 from the church of San Pellegrino, under the high altar of which, as we learn from the Latin inscription, let into the masonry. The martyr's bones still repose with those of two other saints. How long the sarcophagus was deposited in the church of San Pellegrino we do not know, but it is recorded to have been there in the year 1650. We may suppose that the saint's relics were transferred for safety to Ancona at some time in the troubled centuries which followed his martyrdom, when Moesia was occupied and ravaged by successive hordes of barbarian invaders. At all events, it appears certain from the independent and mutually confirmatory evidence of the martyrology and the monuments that Decius was no mythical saint, but a real man who suffered death for his faith at Durostorum, in one of the early centuries of the Christian era. Finding the narrative of the nameless martyrologist thus established as the principal fact recorded, namely the martyrdom of St. Decius, we may reasonably accept his testimony as to the manner and cause of the martyrdom, all the more because his narrative is precise, circumstantial, and entirely free from the miraculous element. Accordingly, I conclude that the account which he gives of the celebration of the Saturnalia among the Roman soldiers is trustworthy. This account sets in a new and lurid light the office of the king of the Saturnalia, the ancient lord of misrule, who presided over the winter revels at Rome in the time of Horace and Tacitus. It seems to prove that his business had not always been that of a mere harlequin or a merry andrew, whose only care was that the revelry should run high, and the fun grow fast and furious, while the fire blazed and crackled on the hearth, while the streets swarmed with festive crowds, and through the clear frosty air, far away to the north, Socrates showed his kernel of snow. When we compare this comic monarch of the gay and the civilized metropolis with his grim counterpart of the rude camp on the Danube, and when we remember the long array of similar figures, ludicrous yet tragic, who in other ages and in other lands, wearing mock crowns and wrapped in sceptred palls, have played their little pranks for a few brief hours or days, then passed before their time to a violent death, we can hardly doubt that the king of the Saturnalia at Rome, as he is depicted by classical writers, we see only a feeble emasculated copy of that original, whose strong features have been fortunately preserved for us by the obscure author of the martyrdom of St. Decius. In other words, the martyrologist's account of the Saturnalia agrees so closely with the accounts of similar rites elsewhere, which could not possibly have been known to him, that the substantial accuracy of his description may be regarded as established. And further, since the custom of putting a mock king to death as a representative of a god cannot have grown out of a practice of appointing him to preside over a holiday revel, whereas the reverse may very well have happened, we are justified in assuming that in an earlier and more barbarous age it was the universal practice in ancient Italy, wherever the worship of Saturn prevailed, to choose a man who played the part and enjoyed all the traditionary privileges of Saturn for a season, and then died, whether by his own or another's hand, whether by the knife or the fire or on the gallows tree, in the character of the good God who gave his life for the world. In Rome itself and other great towns, the growth of civilization had probably mitigated this cruel custom long before the Augustan age, and transformed it into the innocent shape it wears in the writings of the few classical writers who bestow a passing notice on the holiday king of the Saturnalia. But in remoter districts, the older and sterner practice may long have survived, and even if after the unification of Italy the barbarous usage was suppressed by the Roman government, the memory of it would be handed down by the peasants, and would tend from time to time, as still happens with the lowest forms of superstition among ourselves, to lead to a recrudescence of the practice, especially among the rude soldiery on the outskirts of the empire, over whom the once iron hand of Rome was beginning to relax its grip. The resemblance between the Saturnalia of ancient and the carnival of modern Italy has often been remarked, but in the light of all the facts that have come before us, we may well ask whether the resemblance does not amount to identity. We have seen that in Italy, Spain, and France, that is, in the countries where the influence of Rome has been deepest and most lasting, a conspicuous feature of the carnival is a burlesque figure personifying the festive season, which, after a short career of glory and dissipation, is publicly shot, burnt, or otherwise destroyed, to the feigned grief or genuine delight of the populace. If the view here suggested of the carnival is correct, this grotesque personage is no other than a direct successor of the old king of the Saturnalia, the master of the revels, the real man who personated Saturn, and, when the revels were over, suffered a real death in his assumed character. The king of the bean on Twelfth Night and the medieval bishop of fools, abbot of unreason, or lord of misrule are figures of the same sort, and may perhaps have had a similar origin. Whether that was so or not, we may conclude with a fair degree of probability that if the king of the wood in Aricia lived and died as an incarnation of a sylvan deity, he had of old a parallel at Rome, in the men who, year by year, were slain in the character of King Saturn, the god of the sown and sprouting seed. Chapter 59. Killing the God in Mexico. By no people does the custom of sacrificing the human representative of a god appear to have been observed so commonly and with so much solemnity as by the Aztecs of ancient Mexico. With the ritual of these remarkable sacrifices we are well acquainted, for it has been fully described by the Spaniards who conquered Mexico in the 16th century, and whose curiosity was naturally excited by the discovery in this distant region of a barbarous and cruel religion, which presented many curious points of analogy to the doctrine and ritual of their own church. They took a captive, says Jesuit Acosta, such as they thought good, and afore they did sacrifice him unto their idols. They gave him the name of the idol, to whom he should be sacrificed, and apparelled him with the same ornaments, like their idol, saying that he did represent the same idol. And during the time that this representation lasted, which was for a year in some feasts, in others 6 months, and in others less, they reverenced and worshipped him in the same manner as the proper idol, and in the meantime he did eat, drink, and was merry. When he went through the streets, the people came forth to worship him, and everyone brought him in alms, with children and sick folks, that he might cure them, and bless them, suffering him to do all things at his pleasure. Only he was accompanied with 10 or 12 men, lest he should fly. And he, to the end he might be reverenced as he passed, sometimes sounded upon a small flute, that the people might prepare to worship him. The feast being come, and he grown fat, they killed him, opened him, and ate him, making a solemn sacrifice of him. This general description of the custom may now be illustrated by particular examples. Thus, at the festival called Toxatl, the greatest festival of the Mexican year, a young man was annually sacrificed in the character of Tezcatlipoca, the god of gods, after having been maintained and worshipped as the great deity in person for a whole year. According to the old Franciscan monk, Sahagún, our best authority on the Aztec religion, the sacrifice of the human god fell at Easter or a few days later, so that, if he is right, it would correspond in date as well as in character to the Christian festival of the death and resurrection of the Redeemer. More exactly, he tells us that the sacrifice took place on the first day of the 5th Aztec month, which, according to him, began on the 23rd or 27th day of April. At this festival, the great god died in the person of one human representative, and came to life again in the person of another, who was destined to enjoy the fatal honor of divinity for a year and to perish, like all his predecessors, at the end of it. The young man singled out for his high dignity was carefully chosen from among the captives on the ground of his personal beauty. He had to be of unblemished body, slim as a reed and straight as a pillar, neither too tall nor too short. If through high living he grew too fat, he was obliged to reduce himself by drinking salt water, and in order that he might behave in his lofty station with becoming grace and dignity, he was carefully trained to comport himself like a gentleman of the first quality, to speak correctly and elegantly, to play the flute, to smoke cigars, and to snuff at flowers with a dandified air. He was honorably lodged in the temple, where the nobles waited on him and paid him homage, bringing him meat and serving him like a prince. The king himself saw to it that he was apparelled in gorgeous attire, for already he esteemed him as a god. Eagle down was gummed to his head, and white cock's feathers were stuck in his hair, which drooped to his girdle. A wreath of flowers like roasted maize crowned his brows, and a garland of the same flowers passed over his shoulders and under his armpits. Golden ornaments hung from his nose, golden armlets adorned his arms, golden bells jingled on his legs at every step he took. Earrings of turquoise dangled from his ears, bracelets of turquoise bedecked his wrists, necklaces of shells encircled his neck and depended on his breast. He wore a mantle of network, and round his middle a rich waistcloth. When this bejewelled, exquisite lounged through the streets, playing on his flute, puffing at a cigar, and smelling at a nosegay, the people whom he met threw themselves on the earth before him, and prayed to him with sighs and tears, taking up the dust in their hands and putting it in their mouths, in token of the deepest humiliation and subjection. Women came forth with children in their arms and presented them to him, saluting him as a god. For he passed for our Lord God, the people acknowledged him as the Lord. All who thus worshipped him on his passage he saluted gravely and courteously. Lest he should flee, he was everywhere attended by a guard of 8 pages in the royal livery. 4 of them with shaven crowns like the palace slaves, and 4 of them with the flowering locks of warriors, and if he contrived to escape, the captain of the guard had to take his place as the representative of the god, and to die in his stead. 20 days before he was to die, his costume was changed, and 4 damsels, delicately nurtured and bearing the names of 4 goddesses, the goddess of flowers, the goddess of the young maize, the goddess our mother among the water, and the goddess of salt, were given him to be his brides, and with them he consorted. During the last 5 days, divine honors were showered on the destined victim. The king remained in his palace, while the whole court went after the human god. Solemn banquets and dances followed each other in regular succession, and at appointed places. On the last day, the young man, attended by his wives and pages, embarked in a canoe covered with a royal canopy, and was ferried across the lake to a spot where a little hill rose from the edge of the water. It was called the Mountain of Parting, because there his wives bade him a last farewell. Then, accompanied only by his pages, he repaired to a small and lonely temple by the wayside. Like the Mexican temples in general, it was built in the form of a pyramid, and as the young man ascended the stairs, he broke at every step one of the flutes on which he had played in the days of his glory. On reaching the summit, he was seized and held down by the priests on his back upon a block of stone, while one of them cut open his breast, thrust his hand into the wound, and retching out his heart, held it up in sacrifice to the sun. The body of the dead god was not, like the bodies of common victims, sent rolling down the steps of the temple, but was carried down to the foot, where the head was cut off and spitted on a pike. Such was the regular end of the man who personated the greatest god of the Mexican pantheon. The honor of living for a short time in the character of a god and dying a violent death in the same capacity was not restricted to men in Mexico. Women were allowed, or rather compelled, to enjoy the glory and to share the dooms as representatives of goddesses. Thus, at the great festival in September, which was preceded by a strict fast of 7 days, they sanctified a young slave girl of 12 or 13 years, the prettiest they could find, to represent the maize goddess, Chicomoquatl. They invested her with the ornaments of the goddess, putting a mitre on her head and maize cobs round her neck and in her hands, and fastening a green feather upright on the crown of her head to imitate an ear of maize. This they did, we are told, in order to signify that the maize was almost ripe at the time of the festival, but because it was still tender, they chose a girl of tender years to play the part of the maize goddess. The whole long day they led the poor child in all her finery, with the green plume nodding on her head, from house to house, dancing merrily to cheer people after the dullness and privations of the fast. In the evening, all the people assembled at the temple, the courts of which they lit up by a multitude of lanterns and candles. There they passed the night without sleeping, and at midnight, while the trumpets, flutes, and horns discoursed solemn music, a portable framework or palanquin was brought forth, bedecked with festoons of maize cobs and peppers, and filled with seeds of all sorts. This the bearer set down at the door of the chamber in which the wooden image of the goddess stood. Now the chamber was adorned and wreathed, both outside and inside, with wreaths of maize cobs, peppers, pumpkins, roses, and seeds of every kind, a wonder to behold. The whole floor was covered deep with these verdant offerings of the pious. When the music ceased, a solemn procession came forth of priests and dignitaries, with flaring lights and smoking censers, leading in their midst the girl who played the part of the goddess. Then they made her mount the framework, where she stood upright on the maize and peppers and pumpkins with which it was strewed, her hands resting on 2 banisters to keep her from falling. Then the priest swung the smoking censers round her. The music struck up again, and while it played, a great dignitary of the temple suddenly stepped up to her with a razor in his hand, and adroitly shore off the green feather she wore on her head, together with the hair in which it was fastened, snipping the lock off the root. The feather and the hair he then presented to the wooden image of the goddess with great solemnity and elaborate ceremonies, weeping and giving her thanks for the fruits of the earth and the abundant crops which she had bestowed on the people that year. And as he wept and prayed, all the people standing in the courts of the temple wept and prayed with him. When the ceremony was over, the girl descended from the framework and was escorted to the place where she was to spend the rest of the night. But all the people kept watch in the courts of the temple by the light of the torches till break of day. The morning being come, and the courts of the temple being still crowded by the multitude, who would have deemed it sacrilege to quit the precincts, the priests again brought forth the damsel attired in the costume of the goddess, with the mitre on her head and the cobs of maize about her neck. Again she mounted the portable framework of the palanquin and stood on it, supporting herself by her hands on the banisters. Then the elders of the temple lifted it on their shoulders, and while some swung burning censers and others played on instruments or sang, they carried it in procession through the great courtyard to the hall of the god Huitzilopochtli, and then back to the chamber where stood the wooden image of the maize goddess, whom the girl personated. There they caused the damsel to descend from the palanquin and to stand on the heaps of the corn and vegetables that had been spread in profusion on the floor of the sacred chamber. While she stood there, all the elders and nobles came in a line, one behind the other, carrying saucers full of dry and clotted blood, which they had drawn from their ears by way of penance during the 7 days' fast. One by one they squatted on their haunches before her, which was equivalent of falling to their knees with us, and scraping the crust of blood from the saucer, cast it down before her as an offering in return for the benefits which she, as the embodiment of the maize goddess, had conferred upon them. When the men had thus humbly offered their blood to the human representative of the goddess, the women, forming a long line, did so likewise, each of them dropping on their hams before the girl and scraping her blood from the saucer. The ceremony lasted a long time, for great and small, young and old, all without exception, had to pass before the incarnate deity and make their offering. When it was over, the people returned home with glad hearts to feast on flesh and viands of every sort as merrily, we are told, as good Christians at Easter partake of meat and other carnal mercies after the long abstinence of Lent. And when they had eaten and drunk their fill, and rested after the night watch, they returned quite refreshed to the temple to see the end of the festival. And the end of the festival was this. The multitude being assembled, the priest solemnly incensed the girl who personated the goddess. Then they threw her on her back, on the heap of corn and seeds, cut off her head, caught the gushing blood in a tub, and sprinkled the blood on the wooden image of the goddess, the walls of the chamber, and the offerings of corn, peppers, pumpkins, seeds, and vegetables, which cumbered the floor. After that, they flayed the headless trunk, and one of the priests made shift to squeeze himself into the bloody skin. Having done so, they clad him in all the robes which the girl had worn. They put the mitre on his head, the necklace of golden maize cobs round his neck, the maize cobs of feathers and gold in his hands, and thus arrayed they led him forth in public, all of them dancing to the tuck of drum, while he acted as fugleman, skipping and posturing at the head of the procession as briskly as he could be expected to do, incommoded as he was by the tight and clammy skin of the girl, and by her clothes, which must have been much too small for a grown man. In the foregoing custom, the identification of the young girl with the maize goddess appears to be complete. The golden maize cobs, which she wore around her neck, the artificial maize cobs, which she carried in her hands, the green feather, which was stuck in her hair in imitation, we are told, of a green ear of maize, all set her forth as a personification of the corn spirit, and we are expressly informed that she was specially chosen as a young girl to represent the young maize, which at the time of the festival had not yet fully ripened. Further, her identification with the corn and the corn goddess was clearly announced by making her stand on the heaps of maize, and there receive the homage and blood offerings of the whole people, who thereby returned her thanks for the benefits which in her character of a divinity she was supposed to have conferred upon them. Once more the practice of beheading her on a heap of corn and seeds and sprinkling her blood not only on the image of the maize goddess, but on the piles of maize, peppers, pumpkins, seeds, and vegetables, can seemingly have had no other object but to quicken and strengthen the crops of corn and the fruits of the earth in general by infusing into their representatives the blood of the corn goddess herself. The analogy of this Mexican sacrifice, the meaning of which appears to be indisputable, may be allowed to strengthen the interpretation which I have given of other human sacrifices offered for the crops. If the Mexican girl whose blood was sprinkled on the maize indeed personated the maize goddess, it becomes more than ever probable that the girl whose blood the Pawnees similarly sprinkled on the seed corn personated, in like manner, the female spirit of the corn. And so, with the other human beings whom other races have slaughtered for the sake of promoting the growth of the crops. Lastly, the concluding act of the sacred drama, in which the body of the dead maize goddess was flayed and her skin worn, together with all her sacred insignia, by a man who danced before the people in his grim attire, seems to be best explained on the hypothesis that it was intended to ensure that the divine death should be immediately followed by the divine resurrection. If that was so, we may infer with some degree of probability see that the practice of killing a human representative of a deity has commonly, perhaps always, been regarded merely as a means of perpetuating the divine energies in the fullness of youthful vigor, untainted by the weakness and frailty of age, from which they must have suffered if the deity had been allowed to die a natural death. These Mexican rites suffice to prove that the human sacrifices of the sort I suppose to have prevailed in Aricia were, as a matter of fact, regularly offered by a people whose level of culture was probably not inferior, if indeed it was not distinctly superior, to that occupied by the Italian races at the early period to which the origin of the Rhaetian priesthood must be referred. The positive and indubitable evidence of the prevalence of such sacrifices in one part of the world may reasonably be allowed to strengthen the probability of their prevalence in places for which the evidence is less full and trustworthy. Taken altogether, the facts which we have passed in review seem to show that the custom of killing men whom their worshippers regard as divine has prevailed in many parts of the world. Chapter 60. Between Heaven and Earth. Subsection 1. Not to touch the earth. At the outset of this book, two questions were proposed for answer. Why had the priest of Aricia to slay his predecessor, and why, before doing so, had he to pluck the golden bough? Of these two questions, the first has now been answered. The priest of Aricia, if I am right, was one of those sacred kings or human divinities on whose life the welfare of the community, and even the course of nature in general, are believed to be intimately dependent. It does not appear that the subjects or worshippers of such a spiritual potentate form to themselves any very clear notion of the exact relationship in which they stand to him. Probably their ideas on the point are vague and fluctuating, and we should err if we attempted to define the relationship with logical precision. All that the people know, or rather imagine, is that somehow they themselves, their cattle, and their crops are mysteriously bound up with their divine king, so that according as he is well or ill, the community is healthy or sickly, the flocks and herds thrive or languish with disease, and the fields yield an abundant or a scanty harvest. The worst evil which they can conceive of is the natural death of their ruler, whether he succumb to sickness or old age, for in the opinion of his followers such a death would entail the most disastrous consequences on themselves and their possessions. Fatal epidemics would sweep away man and beast. The earth would refuse her increase, nay, the very frame of nature itself might be dissolved. To guard against these catastrophes, it is necessary to put the king to death while he is still in the full bloom of his divine manhood, in order that his sacred life, transmitted in unabated force to his successor, may renew its youth, and thus, by successive transmissions, through a perpetual line of vigorous incarnations, may remain eternally fresh and young, a pledge and security that men and animals shall, in like manner, renew their youth by a perpetual succession of generations, and that seed time and harvest in summer and winter, and rain and sunshine shall never fail. That, if my conjecture is right, was why the priest of Aricia, the king of the wood at Nemi, had regularly to perish by the sword of his successor. But we have still to ask, what was the golden bough, and why had each candidate for the Arician priesthood to pluck it before he could slay the priest? These questions I will now try to answer. It will be well to begin by noticing two of those rules or taboos by which, as we have seen, the life of divine kings or priests is regulated. The first of the rules to which I would call the reader's attention is that the divine personage may not touch the ground with his foot. This rule was observed by the supreme pontiff of the Zapotecs in Mexico. He profaned his sanctity if he so much as touched the ground with his foot. Montezuma, Emperor of Mexico, never set foot on the ground. He was always carried on the shoulders of noblemen, and if he lighted away, they laid rich tapestry for him to walk upon. For the Mikado of Japan, to touch the ground with his foot was a shameful degradation. Indeed, in the 16th century, it was enough to deprive him of his office. Outside his palace, he was carried on men's shoulders. Within it, he walked on exquisitely wrought mats. The king and queen of Tahiti might not touch the ground anywhere but within their hereditary domains, for the ground on which they trod became sacred. In traveling from place to place, they were carried on the shoulders of sacred men. They were always accompanied by several pairs of these sanctified attendants, and when it became necessary to change their bearers, the king and queen vaulted onto the shoulders of their new bearers without letting their feet touch the ground. It was an evil omen if the king of Dasuma touched the ground, and he had to perform an expiatory ceremony. Within his palace, the king of Persia walked on carpets on which no one else might tread. Outside of it, he was never seen on foot, but only in a chariot or on horseback. In old days, the king of Siam never set foot upon the earth, but was carried on a throne of gold from place to place. Formerly, neither the kings of Uganda, nor their mothers, nor their queens might walk on foot outside of the spacious enclosures in which they lived. Whenever they went forth, they were carried on the shoulders of men of the Buffalo clan, several of whom accompanied any of these royal personages on a journey and took it in turn to bear the burden. The king sat astride the bearer's neck, with a leg over each shoulder and his feet tucked under the bearer's arms. When one of these royal carriers grew tired, he shot the king onto the shoulders of a second man without allowing the royal feet to touch the ground. In this way they went at a great pace, and traveled long distances in a day when the king was on a journey. The bearers had a special hut in the king's enclosure, in order to be at hand the moment they were wanted. Among the Bakuba, or rather Bushongo, a nation in the southern region of the Congo, down to a few years ago, persons of the royal blood were forbidden to touch the ground. They must sit on a hide, a chair, or the back of a slave, who crouched on hands and feet. Their feet rested on the feet of others. When they traveled, they were carried on the backs of men, but the king journeyed on a litter supported on shafts. Among the Igbo people about Aka, in southern Nigeria, the priest of the earth has to observe many taboos. For example, he may not see a corpse, and if he meets one on the road, he must hide his eyes with his wristlet. He must abstain from many foods, such as eggs, birds of all sorts, mutton, dog, hushbuck, and so forth. He may neither wear nor touch a mask, and no masked man may enter his house. If a dog enters his house, it is killed and thrown out. As priest of the earth, he may not sit on the bare ground, nor eat things that have fallen on the ground, nor may earth be thrown at him. According to ancient Brahmanic ritual, a king at his inauguration trod on a tiger skin and a golden plate. He was shod with shoes of boarskin, and so long as he lived thereafter, he might not stand on the earth with his bare feet. But besides persons who are permanently sacred or tabooed, and are therefore permanently forbidden to touch the ground with their feet, there are others who enjoy the character of sanctity or taboo only on certain occasions, and to whom accordingly the prohibition in question only applies at the definite seasons during which they exhale the odor of sanctity. Thus among the Kayans or Boughs of central Borneo, while the priestesses are engaged in the performance of certain rites, they may not step on the ground, and boards are laid for them to tread on. Warriors, again, on the warpath are surrounded, so to say, by an atmosphere of taboo. Hence, some Indians of North America might not sit on the bare ground the whole time they were out on a warlike expedition. In Laos, the hunting of elephants gives rise to many taboos. One of them is that the chief hunter may not touch the earth with his foot. Accordingly, when he alights from his elephant, the others spread a carpet of leaves for him to step upon. Apparently, holiness, magical virtue, taboo, or whatever we may call the mysterious quality which is supposed to pervade sacred or tabooed persons, is conceived by the primitive philosopher as a physical substance or fluid with which the sacred man is charged, just as a Leyden jar is charged with electricity, and exactly as the electricity in the jar can be discharged by contact with a good conductor, so the holiness or magical virtue in the man can be discharged and drained away by contact with the earth, which on this theory serves as an excellent conductor for the magical fluid. Hence, in order to preserve the charge from running to waste, the sacred or tabooed personage must be carefully prevented from touching the ground. In electrical language, he must be insulated, if he is not to be emptied of the precious substance or fluid with which he, as a vial, is filled to the brim. And in many cases, apparently, the insulation of the tabooed person is recommended as a precaution, not merely for his own sake, but for the sake of others. For since the virtue of holiness or taboo is, so to say, a powerful explosive, which the smallest touch may detonate, it is necessary in the interest of the general safety to keep it within narrow bounds, lest breaking out it should blast, blight, and destroy whatever it comes into contact with. Subsection 2. Not to see the sun. The second rule to be here noted is that the sun may not shine upon the divine person. This rule was observed both by the Mikado and by the pontiff of the Zapotecs. The latter was looked upon as a god whom the earth was not worthy to hold, nor the sun to shine upon. The Japanese would not allow that the Mikado should expose his sacred person to the open air, and the sun was not thought worthy to shine on his head. The Indians of Grenada in South America kept those who were to be rulers or commanders, whether men or women, locked up for several years when they were children, some of them 7 years, and this so close that they were not to see the sun. For if they should happen to see it, they forfeited their lordship courtship, eating certain sorts of food appointed, and those who were their keepers at certain times went into the retreat or prison and scourged them severely. Thus, for example, the heir to the throne of Bogota, who was not the son but the sister's son of the king, had to undergo a rigorous training from his infancy. He lived in complete retirement in a temple, where he might not see the sun, nor eat salt, nor converse with a woman. He was surrounded by guards who observed his conduct and noted all his actions. If he broke a single one of the rules laid down for him, he was deemed infamous and forfeited all his rights to the throne. So too the heir to the kingdom of Sogamoso, before succeeding to the crown, had to fast for 7 years in the temple, being shut up in the dark and not allowed to see the sun or light. The prince, who was to become Inca of Peru, had to fast for a month without seeing light. Subsection 3. The seclusion of girls at puberty. Now it is remarkable that the foregoing 2 rules, not to touch the ground and not to see the sun, are observed either separately or conjointly by girls at puberty in many parts of the world. Thus, amongst the people of Loango, girls at puberty are confined in separate huts, and they may not touch the ground with any part of their bare body. Among the Zulus and kindred tribes of South Africa, when the first signs of puberty show themselves, while a girl is walking, gathering wood, or working in the field, she runs to the river and hides herself among the reeds for the day, so as not to be seen by men. She covers her head carefully with her blanket, that the sun may not shine on it, and shrivel her up into a withered skeleton, as would result from exposure to the sun's beams. After dark she returns to her home, and is secluded in a hut for some time. With the Awakande, a tribe at the northern end of Lake Nyassa, it is a rule that after her first menstruation, a girl must be kept apart with a few companions of her own sex, in a darkened house. The floor is covered with dried banana leaves, but no fire may be lit in the house, which is called the house of the Awasangu, that is, of maidens who have no hearts. In New Ireland, girls are confined for 4 or 5 years in small cages, being kept in the dark and not allowed to set foot on the ground. The custom has been thus described by an eyewitness. I heard from a teacher about some strange custom connected with some of the young girls here, so I asked the chief to take me to the house where they were. The house was about 25 feet in length, and stood in a reed and bamboo enclosure, across the entrance to which a bundle of dried grass was suspended, to show that it was strictly taboo. Inside the house were 3 conical structures, about 7 or 8 feet in height, and about 10 or 12 feet in circumference at the bottom, and for about 4 feet from the ground, at which point they tapered off to a point at the top. These cages were made of the broad leaves of the pandanus tree, sewn quite close together so that no light and little or no air could enter. On one side of each is an opening, which is closed by a double door of plaited cocoa-nut tree and pandanus tree leaves. About 3 feet from the ground, there is a stage of bamboos, which form the floor. In each of these cages, we were told, there was a young woman confined, each of whom had to remain for at least 4 or 5 years, without ever being allowed to go outside the house. I could scarcely credit the story when I heard it. The whole thing seemed too horrible to be true. I spoke to the chief, and told him that I wished to see the inside of the cages, and also to see the girls, that I might make them a present of a few beads. He told me that it was taboo, forbidden, for any men but their own relations to look at them, but I suppose the promised beads acted as an inducement, and so he sent away for some old lady who had charge, and who alone is allowed to open the doors. While we were waiting, we could hear the girls talking to the chief in querulous way, as if objecting to something or expressing their fears. The old woman came at length, and certainly she did not seem a very pleasant jailer or guardian, nor did she seem to favor the request of the chief to allow us to see the girls, as she regarded us with anything but pleasant looks. However, she had to undo the door when the chief told her to do so, and then the girls peeped out at us, and, when told to do so, they held out their hands for the beads. I, however, purposely sat at some distance away and merely held out the beads to them, as I wished to draw them quite outside, that I might inspect the inside of the cages. This desire of mine gave rise to another difficulty, as these girls were not allowed to put their feet to the ground all the time they were confined in these places. However, they wished to get the beads, and so the old lady had to go outside and collect a lot of pieces of wood and bamboo, which she placed on the ground, and then, going to one of the girls, she helped her down and held her hand, as she stepped from one piece of wood to another, until she came near enough to get the beads I held out to her. I then went to inspect the inside of the cage out of which she had come, room, but could scarcely put my head inside of it. The atmosphere was so hot and stifling. It was clean and contained nothing but a few short lengths of bamboo for holding water. There was only room for the girl to sit or lie down in a crouched position on the bamboo platform, and when the doors are shut, it must be nearly or quite dark inside. The girls are never allowed to come out except once a day to bathe in a dish or wooden bowl placed close to each cage. They say that they perspire profusely. They are placed in these stifling cages when quite young, and must remain there until they are young women, when they are taken out and have each a great marriage feast provided for them. One of them was about 14 or 15 years old, and the chief told us that she had been there for 5 years, but would soon be taken out now. The other 2 were about 8 and 10 years old, and they have to stay there for several years longer. In Kabadi, a district of British New Guinea, daughters of chiefs, when they are about 12 or 13 years of age, are kept indoors for 2 or 3 years, never being allowed under any pretense to descend from the house, and the house is so shaded that the sun cannot shine on them. Among the Yubim of Bakawa, 2 neighboring and kindred tribes on the coast of northern New Guinea, a girl at puberty is secluded for some 5 or 6 weeks in an inner part of the house, but she may not sit on the floor, lest her uncleanness should cleave to it, so a log of wood is placed for her to squat on. Moreover, she may not touch the ground with her feet. Hence, if she is obliged to quit the house for a short time, she is muffled up in mats and walks on 2 halves of coconut shells, which are fastened like sandals to her feet by creeping plants. Among the Atdanums of Borneo, girls at the age of 8 or 10 are shut up in a little room or cell of the house, and cut off from all intercourse with the world for a long time. The cell, like the rest of the house, is raised on piles above the ground, and is lit by a single small window opening on a lonely place, so that the girl is in almost total darkness. She may not leave the room on any pretext whatsoever, not even for the most necessary purposes. None of her family may see her all the time she is shut up, but a single slave woman is appointed to wait on her. During her lonely confinement, which often lasts 7 years, the girl occupies herself in weaving mats or with other handiwork. Her bodily growth is stunted by the long want of exercise, and when, on attaining womanhood, she is brought out, her complexion is pale and wax-like. She is now shown the sun, the earth, the water, the trees, and the flowers, as if she were newly born. Then a great feast is made, a slave is killed, and the girl is smeared with his blood. In Saram, girls at puberty are formerly shut up by themselves in a hut, which was kept dark. In Yap, one of the Caroline Islands, should a girl be overtaken by her first menstruation on the public road, she may not sit down on the earth, but must beg for a coconut shell to put under her. She is shut up for several days in a small hut at a distance from her parents' house, and afterwards she is bound to sleep for 100 days in one of the special houses which are provided for the use of menstruous women. In the island of Bubuyeg, Torres Straits, when the signs of puberty appear on a girl, a circle of bushes is made in a dark corner of the house, here decked with shoulder belts, armlets, leglets, just below the knees, and anklets, wearing a chaplet on her head, and shell ornaments in her ears. On her chest and on her back she squats in the midst of the bushes, which are piled so high round her that only her head is visible. In this state of seclusion she must remain for 3 months. All this time the sun may not shine upon her, but at night she is allowed to slip out of the hut, and the bushes that hedge her in are then changed. She may not feed herself or handle food, but is fed by 1 or 2 old women, her maternal aunts, who are especially appointed to look after her. One of these women cooks food for her at a special fire in the forest. The girl is forbidden to eat turtle or turtle eggs during the season when the turtles are breeding, but no vegetable food is refused her. No man, not even her own father, may come into the house while her seclusion lasts, for if her father saw her at this time, he would certainly have bad luck in his fishing, and would probably smash his canoe the very next time he went out in it. At the end of the 3 months, she is carried down to a freshwater creek by her attendants, hanging on to their shoulders in such a way that her feet do not touch the ground, while the women of the tribe form a ring around her, and thus escort her to the beach. Arrived at the shore, she is stripped of her ornaments, and the bearers stagger with her into the creek, where they immerse her, and all the other women join in splashing water over both the girl and her bearers. When they come out of the water, one of the 2 attendants makes a heap of grass for her charge to squat upon. The other runs to the reef, catches a small crab, tears off its claws, and hastens back with them to the creek. Here, in the meantime, a fire has been kindled, and the claws are roasted at it. The girl is then fed by her attendants with the roasted claws. After that, she is freshly decorated, and the whole party marches back to the village in a single rank, the girl walking in the center between her 2 old aunts, who hold her by the wrists. The husbands of her aunts now receive her and lead her into the house of one of them, where all partake of food, and the girl is allowed once more to feed herself in the usual manner. A dance follows, in which the girl takes a prominent part, dancing between the husbands of the two aunts who had charge of her in her retirement. Among the Yarikana tribe of Cape York Peninsula in northern Queensland, a girl at puberty is said to live by herself for a month or 6 weeks. No man may see her, though any woman may. She stays in a hut or shelter specially made for her, on the floor of which she lies supine. She may not see the sun, and towards sunset she must keep her eyes shut until the sun has gone down. Otherwise, it is thought that her nose will be diseased. During her seclusion, she may eat nothing that lives in salt water, or a snake would kill her. An old woman waits upon her and supplies her with roots, yams, and water. Some Australian tribes are wont to bury their girls at such seasons more or less deeply in the ground, perhaps in order to hide them from the light of the sun. Among the Indians of California, a girl at her first menstruation was thought to be possessed of a particular degree of supernatural power, and this was not always regarded as entirely defiling or malevolent. Often, however, there was a strong feeling of the power of evil inherent in her condition. Not only was she secluded from her family and the community, but an attempt was made to seclude the world from her. One of the injunctions most strongly laid upon her was not to look about her. She kept her head bowed and was forbidden to see the world and the sun. Some tribes covered her with a blanket. Many of the customs in this connection resembled those of the North Pacific coast most strongly, such as the prohibition to the girl to touch or scratch her head with her hand, a special implement being furnished for the purpose. Sometimes she could eat only when fed, and in other cases fasted altogether. Among the Chinook Indians, who inhabited the coast of Washington state, when a chief's daughter attained to puberty, she was hidden for 5 days from the view of the people. She might not look at them, nor at the sky, nor might she pick berries. It was believed that if she were to look at the sky, the weather would be bad, that if she picked berries, it would rain, and that when she hung her towel of cedar bark on a spruce tree, the tree withered up at once. She went out of the house by a separate door, and bathed in a creek far from the village. She fasted for some days, and for many days more she might not eat fresh food. Amongst the At or Nootka Indians of Vancouver Island, when girls reach puberty, they are placed in a sort of gallery in the house, and are there surrounded completely with mats, so that neither the sun nor any fire can be seen. In the cage they remain for several days. Water is given them, but no food. The longer a girl remains in this retirement, the greater honor is it to the parents. But she is disgraced for life if it is known that she has seen fire or the sun during the initiatory ordeal. Pictures of the mythical Thunderbird are painted on the screens behind which she hides. During her seclusion, she may neither move nor lie down, but must always sit in a squatting posture. She may not touch her hair with her hands, but is allowed to scratch her head with a comb or a piece of bone provided for the purpose. To scratch her body is also forbidden, as it is believed that every scratch could leave a scar. For 8 months after reaching maturity, she may not eat any fresh food, particularly salmon. Moreover, she must eat by herself and use a cup and dish of her own. In the Tsetsaut tribe of British Columbia, a girl at puberty wears a large hat of skin which comes down over her face and screens it from the sun. It is believed that if she were to expose her face to the sun or to the sky, rain would fall. The hat protects her face also against the fire, which ought not to strike her skin. To shield her hands, she wears mittens. In her mouth she carries the tooth of an animal to prevent her own teeth from becoming hollow. For a whole year, she may not see blood unless her face is blackened. Otherwise, she would grow blind. For 2 years, she wears the hat and lives in a hut by herself, although she is allowed to see other people. At the end of 2 years, a man takes the hat from her head and throws it away. In the Bilquila or Bellacoola tribe of British Columbia, when a girl attains puberty, she must stay in the shed which serves as her bedroom, where she has a separate fireplace. She is not allowed to descend to the main part of the house, and may not sit by the fire of the family. For 4 days she is bound to remain motionless in a sitting posture. She fasts during the day, but is allowed a little food and drink very early in the morning. After the 4 days' seclusion, she may leave her room, but only through a separate opening cut in the floor, for the houses are raised on piles. She may not yet come into the chief room. In leaving the house, she wears a large hat which protects her face against the rays of the sun. It is believed that if the sun were to shine on her face, her eyes would suffer. She may pick berries on the hills, but may not come near the river or sea for a whole year. Were she to eat fresh salmon, she would lose her senses, or her mouth would be changed into a long beak. Amongst the Tlingit or Thlinkit, or Kalish Indians of Alaska, when a girl showed signs of womanhood, she used to be confined to a little hut or cage, which was completely blocked up with the exception of a small air hole. In this dark and filthy abode, she had to remain a year without fire, exercise, or associates. Only her mother and a female slave might supply her with nourishment. Her food was put in at the little window. She had to drink out of the wing bone of a white-headed eagle. The time of her seclusion was afterwards reduced in some places to 6 or 3 months, or even less. She had to wear a sort of hat with long flaps, that her gaze might not pollute the sky, for she was thought unfit for the sun to shine upon, and it was imagined that her look would destroy the luck of a hunter, fisher, or gambler, turn things to stone, and do other mischief. At the end of her confinement, her old clothes were burnt, new ones were made, and a feast was given, at which a slit was cut in her upper lip parallel to the mouth, and a piece of wood or shell was inserted to keep the aperture open. Among the Konyags, an Eskimo people of Alaska, a girl at puberty was placed in a small hut in which she had to remain on her hands and feet for 6 months. Then the hut was enlarged a little so as to allow her to straighten her back, but in this posture she had to remain for 6 months more. All this time she was regarded as an unclean being with whom no one might hold intercourse. When symptoms of puberty appeared on a girl for the first time, the Guaranis of southern Brazil, on the borders of Paraguay, used to sew her up in her hammock, leaving only a small opening in it to allow her to breathe. In this condition, wrapped up and shrouded like a corpse, she was kept for 2 or 3 days, or so long as the symptoms lasted, and during this time she had to observe a most rigorous fast. After that she was entrusted to a matron, who cut the girl's hair and enjoined her to abstain most strictly from eating flesh of any kind until her hair should be grown long enough to hide her ears. In similar circumstances, the Chiriguanos of southeastern Bolivia hoisted the girl in her hammock to the roof, where she stayed for a month. The 2nd month, the hammock was let halfway down from the roof, and in the 3rd month, old women, armed with sticks, entered the hut and ran about, striking everything they met, saying they were hunting the snake that had wounded the girl. Among the Matacos, or Matagayos, an Indian tribe of the Gran Chaco, a girl at puberty has to remain in seclusion for some time. She lies covered up with branches or other things in a corner of the hut, seeing no one and speaking to no one, and during this time she may eat neither flesh nor fish. Meantime, a man beats a drum in front of the house. Among the Yuracares, an Indian tribe of eastern Bolivia, when a girl perceives the signs of puberty, her father constructs a little hut of palm leaves near the house. In this cabin he shuts up his daughter so that she cannot see the light, and there she remains fasting rigorously for 4 days. Amongst the Macusis of British Guiana, when a girl shows the first signs of puberty, she is hung in a hammock at the highest point of the hut. For the first few days she may not leave the hammock by day, but at night she must come down, light a fire, and spend the night beside it. Else she would break out in sores on her neck, throat, and other parts of her body. So long as the symptoms are at their height, she must fast rigorously. When they have abated, she may come down and take up her abode in a little compartment that is made for her in the darkest corner of the hut. In the morning she may cook her food, but it must be at a separate fire and in a vessel of her own. After about 10 days, the magician comes and undoes the spell by muttering charms and breathing on her and on the more valuable of her things with which she has come in contact. The pots and drinking vessels which she used are broken and the fragments buried. After her first bath, the girl must submit to be beaten by her mother with thin rods without uttering a cry. At the end of the 2nd period, she is again beaten, but not afterwards. She is now clean and can mix again with people. Other Indians of Guyana, after keeping the girl in her hammock at the top of the hut for a month, expose her to certain large ants whose bite is very painful. Sometimes, in addition to being stung with ants, the sufferer has to fast day and night, so long as she remains slung up on high in her hammock, so that when she comes down she is reduced to a skeleton. When a Hindu maiden reaches maturity, she is kept in a dark room for 4 days, and is forbidden to see the sun. She is regarded as unclean. No one may touch her. Her diet is restricted to boiled rice, milk, sugar, curd, and tamarind without salt. On the morning of the 5th day, she goes to a neighboring tank, accompanied by 5 women whose husbands are alive. Smeared with turmeric water, they all bathe and return home, throwing away the mat and other things that were in the room. The Rari Brahmins of Bengal compel a girl at puberty to live alone, and do not allow her to see the face of any male. For 3 days she remains shut up in a dark room, and has to undergo certain penances. Fish, flesh, and sweet meats are forbidden her. She must live upon rice and ghee. Among the Tians of Malabar, a girl is thought to be polluted for 4 days from the beginning of her first menstruation. During this time, she must keep to the north side of the house, where she sleeps on a grass mat of a particular kind in a room festooned with garlands of young coconut leaves. Another girl keeps her company and sleeps with her, but she may not touch any other person, tree, or plant. Further, she may not see the sky, and woe betide her if she catches sight of a crow or a cat. Her diet must be strictly vegetarian, without salt, tamarinds, or chilies. She is armed against evil spirits by a knife, which is placed on the mat or carried on her person. In Cambodia, a girl at puberty is put to bed under a mosquito curtain, where she should stay 100 days. Usually, however, 4, 5, 10, or 20 days are thought enough, and even this, in a hot climate and under the close meshes of the curtain, is sufficiently trying. According to another account, a Cambodian maiden at puberty is said to enter into the shade during her retirement, which, according to the rank and position of her family, may last any time from a few days to several years. She has to observe a number of rules, such as not to be seen by a strange man, not to eat flesh or fish, and so on. She goes nowhere, not even to the pagoda. But this state of seclusion is discontinued during eclipses. At such times she goes forth and pays her devotions to the monster who is supposed to cause eclipses by catching the heavenly bodies between his teeth. This permission to break her rule of retirement and appear abroad during an eclipse seems to show how literally the injunction is interpreted, which forbids maidens entering on womanhood to look upon the sun. A superstition so widely diffused as this might be expected to leave traces in legends and folk tales. And it has done so. The old Greek story of Danae, who was confined by her father in a subterranean chamber or a brazen tower, but impregnated by Zeus, who reached her in the shape of a shower of gold, perhaps belongs to this class of tales. It has its counterpart in the legend which the Kirghiz of Siberia tell of their ancestry. A certain Khan had a fair daughter, whom he kept in a dark iron house, that no man might see her. An old woman tended her, and when the girl was grown to maidenhood, she asked the old woman, "Where do you go so often?" "My child," said the old dame, "there is a bright world. In that bright world your father and mother live, and all sorts of people live there. That is where I go." The maiden said, "Good mother, I will tell nobody, but show me that bright world." So the old woman took the girl out of the iron house. But when she saw the bright world, the girl tottered and fainted, and the eye of God fell upon her, and she conceived. Her angry father put her in a golden chest and sent her floating away. Fairy gold can float in fairyland over the wide sea. The shower of gold in the Greek story and the eye of God in the Kirghiz legend probably stand for sunlight and the sun. The idea that women may be impregnated by the sun is not uncommon in legends, and there are even traces of it in marriage customs. Subsection 4. Reasons for the seclusion of girls at puberty. The motive for the restraints so commonly imposed on girls at puberty is the deeply ingrained dread which primitive man universally entertains of menstruous blood. He fears it at all times, but especially on its first appearance. Hence, the restrictions under which women lie at their first menstruation are usually more stringent than those which they have to observe at any subsequent recurrence of the mysterious flow. Some evidence of the fear and of the customs based on it has been cited in an earlier part of this work, but as the terror, for it is nothing less, which the phenomenon periodically strikes into the mind of the savage, has deeply influenced his life and institutions, it may be well to illustrate the subject with some further examples. Thus, in the Encounter Bay tribe of South Australia, there is, or used to be, a superstition which obliges a woman to separate herself from the camp at the time of her monthly illness. When, if a young man or boy should approach, she calls out, and he immediately makes his circuit to avoid her. If she is neglectful upon this point, she exposes herself to scolding, and sometimes to severe beating by her husband or nearest relation, because the boys are told from their infancy that if they see the blood, they will clearly become grey-headed, and their strength will fail prematurely. The Diuri of Central Australia believe that if women at these times were to eat fish or bathe in a river, the fish would all die, and the water would dry up. The Runta of the same region forbid menstruous women to gather the Irakura bulbs, which form a staple article of diet for both men and women. They think that were a woman to break this rule, the supply of bulbs would fail. In some Australian tribes, the seclusion of menstruous women was even more rigid, and was enforced by severer penalties than a scolding or beating. Thus, there is a regulation relating to camps in the Wakalbura tribe, which forbids the women coming into the encampment by the same paths as the men. Any violation of this rule would in a large camp be punished with death. The reason for this is the dread with which they regard the menstrual period of women. During such a time, a woman is kept entirely away from the camp, half a mile at least. A woman in such a condition has boughs of some tree of her totem tied round her loins, and is constantly watched and guarded, for it is thought that should any male be so unfortunate as to see a woman in such a condition, he would die. If such a woman were to let herself be seen by a man, she would probably be put to death. When the woman has recovered, she is painted red and white, her head covered with feathers, and returns to the camp. In Muralug, one of the Torres Strait Islands, a menstruous woman may not eat anything that lives in the sea, else the natives believe that the fisheries would fail. In Galela, to the west of New Guinea, women at their monthly periods may not enter a tobacco field, or the plants would be attacked by disease. The Minangkabaurs of Sumatra are persuaded that if a woman in her unclean state were to go near a rice field, the crop would be spoiled. The Bushmen of South Africa think that, by a glance of a girl's eye at the time when she ought to be kept in strict retirement, men become fixed in whatever position they happen to occupy, with whatever they were holding in their hands, and are changed into trees that talk. Cattle-rearing tribes of South Africa hold that their cattle would die if the milk were drunk by a menstruous woman, and they fear the same disaster if a drop of her blood were to fall on the ground and the oxen were to pass over it. To prevent such a calamity, women in general, not menstruous women only, are forbidden to enter the cattle enclosure, and more than that, they may not use the ordinary paths in entering the village or in passing from one hut to another. They are obliged to make circuitous tracks at the back of the huts in order to avoid the ground in the middle of the village where the cattle stand or lie down. These women's tracks may be seen at every Kafra village. Among the Baganda, in like manner, no menstruous woman might drink milk or come into contact with any milk vessel, and she might not touch anything that belonged to her husband, nor sit on his mat, nor cook his food. If she touched anything of this at such a time, it was deemed equivalent to wishing him dead or to actually working magic for his destruction. Were she to handle any article of his, he would surely fall ill. Were she to touch his weapons, he would certainly be killed in the next battle. Further, the Baganda would not suffer a menstruous woman to visit a well. If she did so, they feared that the water would dry up, and that she herself would fall sick and die, unless she confessed her fault and the medicine man made atonement for her. Among the Kikyu of British East Africa, if a new hut is built in a village, and the wife chances to menstruate in it on the day she lights the first fire there, the hut must be broken down and demolished the very next day. The woman may on no account sleep a second night in it. There's a curse both on her and on it. According to the Talmud, if a woman, at the beginning of her period, passes between two men, she thereby kills one of them. Peasants of the Lebanon think that menstruous women are the cause for many misfortunes. Their shadow causes flowers to wither and trees to perish. It even arrests the movements of serpents. If one of them mounts a horse, the animal might die, or at least be disabled for a long time. The Guayquiris of the Orinoco believe that when a woman has her courses, everything upon which she steps will die, and that if a man treads on the place where she has passed, his legs will immediately swell up. Among the Bribri Indians of Costa Rica, a married woman at her periods uses for plates only banana leaves, which, when she has done with them, she throws away in a sequestered spot. For should a cow find and eat them, the animal would waste away and perish. Also, she drinks only out of a special vessel, because any person who would afterwards drink out of the same vessel would infallibly pine away and die. Among most tribes of North American Indians, the custom was that women, in their courses, retired from the camp or the village, and lived during the time of their uncleanness in special huts or shelters, which were appropriated to their use. There they dwelt apart, eating and sleeping by themselves, warming themselves at their own fires, and strictly abstaining from all communications with men, who shunned them just as if they were stricken with the plague. Thus, to take examples, the Greek and kindred Indians of the United States compelled women at menstruation to live in separate huts at some distance from the village. There, the women had to stay at the risk of being surprised and cut off by enemies. It was thought a most horrid and dangerous pollution to go near the women at such times. and the danger extended to enemies who, if they slew the women, had to cleanse themselves from the pollution by means of certain sacred herbs and roots. The Sealy's Indians of British Columbia imagined that if a menstruous woman were to step over a bundle of arrows, the arrows would thereby be rendered useless and might even cause the death of their owner. And similarly, that if she passed in front of a hunter who carried a gun, the weapon would never shoot straight again. Among the Chippewas and other Indians of the Hudson Bay Territory, menstruous women are excluded from the camp and take up their abode in huts of branches. They wear long hoods which effectually conceal the head and breast. They may not touch the household furniture, nor any objects used by men, for their touch is supposed to defile them, so that their subsequent use would be followed by certain mischief or misfortune, such as disease or death. They must drink out of a swan's bone. They may not walk on the common paths, nor cross the tracks of animals. They are never permitted to walk on the ice of rivers or lakes, or near the part where the men are hunting beaver, or where a fishing net is set, for fear of averting their success. They are also prohibited at those times from partaking of the head of any animal, and even from walking in or crossing the track where the head of a deer, moose, beaver, and many other animals have lately been carried, either on a sledge or on the back. To be guilty of a violation of this custom is considered as of the greatest importance, because they firmly believe that it would be a means of preventing the hunter from having an equal success in his future excursions. So the Lapps forbid women at menstruation to walk on the part of the shore where the fishers are in the habit of setting out their fish, and the Eskimo of Bering Strait believe that if hunters were to come near women in their courses, they would catch no game. For a like reason, the Carrier Indians will not suffer a menstruous woman to cross the tracks of animals. If need be, she is carried over them. They think that if she waded in a stream or lake, the fish would die. Amongst the civilized nations of Europe, the superstitions which cluster around this mysterious aspect of woman's nature are not less extravagant than those which prevail among savages. In the oldest existing encyclopedia, the Natural History of Pliny, the list of dangers apprehended from menstruation is longer than any furnished by mere barbarians. According to Pliny, the touch of a menstruous woman turned wine to vinegar, blighted crops, killed seedlings, blasted gardens, brought down the fruit from trees, dimmed mirrors, blunted razors, rusted iron and brass, especially at the waning of the moon, killed bees, or at least drove them from their hives, caused mares to miscarry, and so forth. Similarly, in various parts of Europe, it is still believed that if a woman in her courses enters a brewery, the beer will turn sour. If she touches beer, wine, vinegar, or milk, it will go bad. If she makes jam, it will not keep. If she mounts a mare, it will miscarry. If she touches buds, they will wither. If she climbs a cherry tree, it will die. In Brunswick, people think that if a menstruous woman assists at the killing of a pig, the pork will putrefy. At the Greek island of Kalymnos, a woman at such times may not go to the well to draw water, nor cross a running stream, nor enter the sea. Her presence in a boat is said to raise storms. Thus, the object of secluding women at menstruation is to neutralize the dangerous influences which are supposed to emanate from them at such times. That the danger is believed to be especially great at the first menstruation appears from the unusual precautions taken to isolate girls at this crisis. Two of these precautions have been illustrated above, namely the rules that the girls may not touch the ground nor see the sun. The general effect of these rules is to keep her suspended, so to say, between heaven and earth. Whether enveloped in her hammock and slung up to the roof, as in South America, or raised above the ground in a dark and narrow cage, as in New Ireland, she may be considered to be out of the way of doing mischief, since, being shut off both from the earth and from the sun, she can poison neither of these great resources of life by her deadly contagion. In short, she is rendered harmless by being, in electrical language, insulated. But the precautions thus taken to isolate or insulate the girl are dictated by a regard for her own safety as well as for the safety of others, for it is thought that she herself would suffer if she were to neglect the prescribed regimen. Thus Zulu girls, as we have seen, believed that they would shrivel to skeletons if the sun were to shine on them at puberty, and the Macuses imagined that if a young woman were to transgress the rules, she would suffer from sores on various parts of her body. In short, the girl is viewed as charged with a powerful force, which, if not kept within bounds, may prove destructive both to herself and to all with whom she comes in contact. To repress this force within the limits necessary for the safety of all concerned is the object of the taboos in question. The same explanation applies to the observance of the same rules by divine kings and priests. The uncleanness, as it is called, of girls at puberty, and the sanctity of holy men do not, to the primitive mind, differ materially from each other. They are only different manifestations of the same mysterious energy, which, like energy in general, is in itself neither good nor bad, but becomes beneficent or maleficent according to its application. Accordingly, if, like girls at puberty, divine personages may neither touch the ground nor see the sun, the reason is, on the one hand, a fear lest their divinity might, at contact with earth or heaven, discharge itself with fatal violence on either, and, on the other hand, an apprehension that the divine being, thus drained of his ethereal virtue, might thereby be incapacitated for the future performance of those magical functions, upon the proper discharge of which the safety of the people, and even the world, is believed to hang. Thus, the rules in question fall under the head of the taboos, which we examined in an earlier part of this book. They are intended to preserve the life of the divine person, and with it the life of his subjects and worshippers. Nowhere, it is thought, can his precious yet dangerous life be at once so safe and so harmless as when it is neither in heaven nor in earth, but, as far as possible, suspended between the two. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Midwest Covencast Presents Weekend Reads. We will be back in 2 weeks with our next installment. In the meantime, you can catch up with our other pod, Midwest Covencast. Consider supporting Midwest Covencast and Weekend Reads on our Patreon to gain access to additional content and exclusive Coven merch. You can even join our Coven by following us on social media at Midwest Covencast on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram, and at Midwest Coven on Twitter. You can also keep up with us on our website, MidwestCovencast.com. Until next time, Coven, blessed be.